Hello and welcome. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The rain started falling just as Detective Michael Hayes stepped out of his car. The air was cold and heavy, the kind of damp that seeped into your bones. His flashlight cut a narrow beam through the night, highlighting the path ahead. The house stood at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by wild, overgrown trees. It was old and weathered, its wooden exterior scarred by time and the elements. The address matched the one on his case file, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Michael was investigating the disappearance of a young woman named Emma Caldwell. She had vanished 2 weeks ago, and all leads had gone cold. Her friends and family described her as kind and dependable, not the type to run away without a word. The last clue was a cryptic note found in her apartment that simply read, "Find the whispering door." As he approached the front steps, the faintest sound reached his ears. It was a soft, almost inaudible whisper, like someone breathing words into the wind. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound seemed to come from the house itself, but it was impossible to pinpoint. He knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood in sharp bursts. "Police," he called out. "Detective Hayes. Is anyone home?" No answer. The only response was the whispering, growing ever so slightly louder. He reached for the doorknob and twisted it. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dark entryway. The whispering grew clearer now, though the words were still impossible to make out. It was as if 100 voices spoke at once, their tones overlapping in an unsettling harmony. Michael stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping the room. Dust blanketed the furniture, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. The place looked abandoned, but it felt alive, as if the walls themselves were watching him. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing faintly. "Is anyone here?" The whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. Michael swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the flashlight. He ventured further into the house, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the wooden floors. The living room was filled with old, decaying furniture. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its hands frozen at midnight. On the mantel above the fireplace, a series of photographs were arranged in cracked frames. He picked one up, brushing away the grime. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl, smiling brightly. Something moved in his peripheral vision. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just shadows. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. The whispering returned, louder now. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the house. Michael followed the sound, his nerves on edge. It led him to a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. As he approached the first door, the whispering grew more distinct. He pressed his ear against the wood, straining to make out the words. "Help me." He jerked back, his pulse racing. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Taking a deep breath, he turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On it sat an old cassette recorder. Michael hesitated before pressing the play button. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "You shouldn't be here." The recorder shut off on its own, leaving the room in silence once more. Michael's instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't. Not yet. He had to find Emma. He moved to the next door, the whispering growing louder with each step. Behind the second door was a staircase leading down into a pitch-black basement. The whispering seemed to emanate from below, echoing up the stairs like a beckoning call. Michael hesitated at the top of the staircase, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The whispers felt alive, winding their way around his ears like invisible threads. They didn't sound malicious, but they didn't sound friendly either. They were just there, persistent and eerie, like voices trying to share secrets he didn't want to know. He stepped onto the first creaking stair. The air grew colder with each step he took downward, as if the house itself were exhaling icy breaths. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow staircase ahead. "Emma," he called out, though his voice sounded small and uncertain in the oppressive silence. There was no answer, only the relentless whispering that seemed to grow louder the deeper he descended. The basement was vast and cluttered, filled with stacks of old boxes, broken furniture, and what looked like remnants of someone's life long abandoned. The whispers swirled around him, coming from all directions now, making it impossible to focus. Michael scanned the room, his flashlight catching a glint of something metallic on the far wall. As he moved closer, the object came into view, a large, heavy door made of tarnished brass. It looked completely out of place, standing there in the middle of the basement wall, like it had been transplanted from another time. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, their intricate patterns glowing faintly as the light passed over them. The whispering seemed to be emanating from behind the door. Michael reached out and placed a hand on the cold metal. As soon as his fingers made contact, the whispers stopped. "Detective Hayes." He whipped around, his flashlight sweeping the room. The voice was female, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, spoken directly into the stillness. "Emma?" he asked, his heart pounding. "I'm here," the voice replied, but it sounded distant, muffled. "Where are you?" he demanded, his flashlight searching for any sign of her. Behind the door. Michael turned back to the brass door, his stomach twisting into knots. The voice was coming from the other side, but something about it felt wrong. It sounded like Emma, but it was off, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me what happened?" he asked, pressing his ear to the door. "Please, open it," the voice pleaded, growing fainter. Michael hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him not to touch that door again, but Emma was missing, and if there was even the slightest chance she was behind it, he had to act. He grabbed the large, circular handle and twisted it. The door creaked open with a deep groan, revealing a long, narrow corridor bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The walls were made of smooth, dark stone, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. "Emma?" he called out, stepping through the threshold. As soon as he entered, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. Michael spun around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Damn it," he muttered, turning back toward the corridor. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing down the passageway like a chorus of unseen voices. He followed the sound, his flashlight casting eerie shadows that danced on the stone walls. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It was like the space was alive, shifting around him. Every so often, he thought he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Eventually, the corridor opened into a large chamber. The room was circular, with high, vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and on top of it was a small, intricately carved box. Michael approached the pedestal cautiously. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around the box like a cyclone. He reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a mirror, small and ornate, its silver frame tarnished with age. As he held it up, his reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His reflection didn't move the way it should have. It smiled at him, even though his own face remained frozen in fear. "What the hell?" he whispered, dropping the mirror onto the pedestal. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. Then, without warning, the walls began to shake. "Michael," the voice called again, this time from behind him. He turned slowly, and his blood ran cold. A figure stood at the edge of the chamber, shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid but twisted, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Who are you?" he stammered, stepping back. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. Michael backed away, his heart pounding like a drum. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling his head until he thought he might scream. Michael's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The figure moved closer, its form shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to absorb the faint light in the chamber. As it drew nearer, he could make out its face, or what passed for one. Its features were indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes burned with a cold, unearthly light. "Stay back!" Michael shouted, his voice cracking as he raised his flashlight like a weapon. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying him. Then it spoke, not with a mouth, but directly into his mind. The voice was layered, a chorus of tones that made his skin crawl. "You should not have come here." Michael's breath hitched, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Where's Emma? What did you do to her?" The figure remained silent for a moment. Then it raised a long, skeletal hand and pointed toward the corridor behind him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging him to follow. "She's waiting," the voice said. Michael hesitated. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to find another way out of this nightmare. But the thought of Emma, of leaving her trapped in whatever hell this was, pushed him forward. He turned and ran back into the corridor, the whispers guiding him. The passageway seemed different now, the walls closer, the air heavier. The stone floor was slick beneath his boots, and the light from his flashlight flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. "Emma," he called out, his voice echoing down the endless corridor. "Michael," the voice was faint, but it was hers. He quickened his pace, his pulse hammering in his ears. The corridor opened into another chamber, this one smaller and filled with an eerie blue glow. In the center of the room was a tall mirror, its surface rippling like water. Emma stood on the other side, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Emma!" Michael shouted, rushing toward the mirror. "Michael, help me!" she cried, pressing her hands against the glass. "What is this? How do I get you out?" he demanded, examining the mirror's frame for any kind of mechanism. "It's a trap," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You have to leave. It's too late for me." "No," Michael said, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving without you. Just tell me what to do." Before she could answer, the whispers returned, deafening and chaotic. The mirror's surface began to shimmer, and Emma's image distorted, her features twisting into something monstrous. "Michael," her voice echoed, overlapping with the whispers. He stumbled back, his heart racing. The mirror pulsed with a blinding light, and when it faded, Emma was gone. In her place stood the shadowy figure from before, its burning eyes fixed on him. "You cannot save her," the voice said, reverberating in his mind. "But you can join her." Michael turned and ran, his flashlight flickering wildly as he sprinted back into the corridor. The walls seemed to close in around him, the passage twisting and turning in impossible ways. The whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic with every step. He tripped over something and fell hard, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling away. Pain shot through his arm, but he scrambled to his feet, grabbing the flashlight just as the corridor began to shift. The floor buckled and cracked, and black tendrils began to seep from the walls, writhing like living shadows. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice trembling as he backed away. The tendrils lunged at him, wrapping around his legs and pulling him to the ground. He screamed, clawing at the slick floor as they dragged him toward the chamber with the mirror. "Let me go," he shouted, kicking at the tendrils with all his strength. The whispers grew unbearable, drilling into his skull until he thought his head might split. The tendrils pulled him into the chamber, where the mirror now glowed with an intense, blinding light. "Michael," Emma's voice called again, but it was different now, distorted and otherworldly. He looked up to see her image in the mirror once more, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were black voids, and her mouth twisted into a chilling smile. "Stay with me," she whispered, reaching out through the glass. "No!" Michael screamed, struggling against the tendrils as they lifted him off the ground. The figure emerged from the shadows, its burning eyes locked onto his. "You opened the door," it said. "Now you must pay the price." The tendrils hurled him toward the mirror, and just before he collided with its surface, everything went dark. Michael's consciousness flickered like a dying flame. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the corridor or the chamber with the mirror. He was lying on cold, damp ground, surrounded by an unnatural fog that clung to his skin like wet ash. The air was heavy, filled with a faint metallic scent that made his stomach churn. He sat up slowly, his body aching from the fall, or whatever had just happened. His flashlight was gone, and with it, the fragile sense of control he had been clinging to. Around him, the fog swirled in lazy spirals, revealing glimpses of a landscape that defied logic. The ground was a patchwork of cracked stone and jagged roots that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Towering spires of black rock jetted out at odd angles, their surfaces slick with an oily substance that reflected no light. Above him, the sky was a swirling vortex of dark clouds, punctuated by flashes of green lightning that illuminated the twisted terrain. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "You're where they want you to be," a voice answered from the fog. Michael spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A figure emerged from the mist, a man disheveled and pale, his eyes sunken and haunted. He wore tattered clothes, and his hands trembled as he clutched a rusted knife. "Who are you?" Michael asked, backing away cautiously. The man shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his cracked lips. "Doesn't matter. Been here too long to remember my name. But you're new. Fresh meat." Michael's stomach tightened. "What is this place? How do I get out of here?" The man laughed, a hollow, broken sound that echoed in the fog. "Out? There's no out. Not once you've opened the door. You belong to them now." "Them?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. The man's expression darkened, and he glanced nervously over his shoulder. "The ones who whisper. They're everywhere. Always watching, always waiting. And when they come for you, you'll wish you'd never heard their voices." Michael clenched his fists, his fear giving way to frustration. "I don't have time for riddles. I'm looking for someone, a woman named Emma. Do you know where she is?" The man's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "Emma? You're here because of her?" "Yes," Michael said, his tone firm. "She's trapped here, and I'm going to find her." The man let out a shaky breath, his gaze darting around the fog. "If she's here, she's already lost. You should be worrying about yourself. This place, it takes pieces of you. Your memories, your sanity. Until there's nothing left." Michael refused to accept that. There has to be a way to stop it. A way to escape. The man hesitated, then gestured toward the horizon, where the fog seemed thicker, almost impenetrable. "There's a place deeper in, the heart of it all. If you can reach it, maybe you'll find your answers. Or maybe you'll just find death." "Show me," Michael said without hesitation. The man shook his head. "I'm not going back there. You're on your own, detective." "How do you know I'm a detective?" Michael demanded, but the man was already retreating into the mist, his figure dissolving like smoke. Michael stood alone, his heart pounding. The whispers began again, faint and distant, beckoning him toward the thickest part of the fog. He swallowed hard, steeling himself before pressing forward. The terrain grew more treacherous as he walked, the ground shifting under his feet like it was alive. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, but beneath them, he thought he heard something else, a faint, rhythmic sound. A heartbeat. It pulsed in time with the throbbing roots beneath his feet, growing stronger with each step. The fog thinned slightly, revealing a massive structure ahead. It was a tower, impossibly tall and made of the same black stone as the spires he had seen earlier. The surface of the tower seemed to ripple, as if it were breathing. The heartbeat echoed from within, and the whispers seemed to spiral upward, converging at the top. Michael approached the base of the tower, where a set of enormous double doors loomed before him. They were adorned with the same strange symbols he had seen on the door in the basement, glowing faintly as if alive. Without thinking, he pushed the doors open. Inside was a vast chamber, its walls lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Each one reflected a distorted version of him, some older, some younger, some barely recognizable. At the center of the room was a stone altar, and on it lay Emma. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, but she was alive. "Emma!" Michael ran to her side, shaking her gently. Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a weak groan. "Michael, you came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm going to get you out of here," he promised, though he had no idea how. Before he could say more, the mirrors began to shimmer, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The roaring whispers swirled around Michael and Emma, pressing against his ears and making it almost impossible to think. He glanced at the mirrors lining the walls. Their surfaces rippled like water, and distorted reflections of him and Emma twisted and contorted, their movements independent of his own. "Michael, it's too late," Emma murmured, her voice weak and trembling. "No," he said firmly, kneeling beside her and gripping her shoulders. "I didn't come all this way to lose you. We're getting out of here, together." Emma shook her head slowly, tears streaking her pale face. "You don't understand. It's not just me. This place, it's alive. It won't let us go." The air around them grew colder, and the room seemed to shrink as the mirrors pulsed with an eerie, rhythmic light. The distorted reflections began to step forward, breaking free of their glass prisons. One by one, they emerged, shambling toward Michael and Emma like grotesque mockeries of life. Michael stood, putting himself between Emma and the advancing reflections. His pulse raced as he scanned the room for anything he could use as a weapon. His flashlight was gone, and he felt utterly defenseless against the nightmarish figures closing in. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. The reflections didn't stop. Their features twisted further with each step, faces melting, limbs elongating unnaturally. One of them, a version of Michael with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, lunged at him. Without thinking, Michael grabbed a loose shard of glass from the floor, jagged and sharp, and swung it at the creature. The shard sliced through the reflection, which dissolved into black mist with a guttural hiss. "Michael!" Emma screamed as more reflections closed in. Michael turned, gripping the glass shard tightly. "Stay behind me!" He fought off one reflection after another, each swipe of the shard reducing them to mist. But they kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. The whispers grew louder, pounding in his skull like a relentless drumbeat. "Why are they doing this?" Michael shouted, his voice breaking under the strain. "They're protecting it," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "Protecting what?" he demanded, slicing through another reflection. Emma pointed weakly toward the far end of the chamber. There, behind the altar, stood another mirror, larger and more ornate than the rest. Its frame was carved with intricate patterns that glowed with the same faint light as the symbols on the doors. The surface of the mirror was different, too, dark and still, like a pool of black water. "That's the heart," Emma whispered. "Destroy it, and maybe we can break free." Michael didn't hesitate. He surged toward the mirror, dodging the grasping hands of the remaining reflections. The closer he got, the colder the air became, until it felt like knives against his skin. The whispers reached a fever pitch as he stood before the black mirror. He raised the shard of glass, his hand trembling. "Do it, Michael," Emma shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. He brought the shard down with all his strength, shattering the surface of the mirror. The effect was instantaneous. A deafening scream erupted from the mirror as it cracked and splintered, the shards falling away into nothingness. The room shook violently, and the reflections dissolved into mist, their forms vanishing into the air. Michael stumbled back, shielding Emma with his body as the chamber began to collapse. The mirrors lining the walls shattered one by one, their shards raining down like deadly rain. "Hold on!" Michael shouted, grabbing Emma and pulling her to her feet. The two of them ran toward the double doors, the ground cracking and splitting beneath them. The air was filled with a deafening roar, and the once solid walls of the chamber crumbled into swirling fog. Michael pushed the doors open, and they stumbled into the corridor beyond. Behind them, the chamber collapsed completely, the tower imploding in on itself with a blinding flash of light. They kept running, the corridor twisting and shifting around them. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more unsettling. Finally, they reached the end of the corridor, where another brass door loomed before them. Michael grabbed the handle and twisted it, throwing the door open. Blinding sunlight poured in, and the two of them stumbled out onto soft grass. Michael blinked against the sudden brightness, his heart still racing. They were outside. Emma collapsed beside him, her breaths ragged. We made it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Michael sat beside her, staring at the old house they had emerged from. It was quiet now, its windows dark and lifeless. But as he caught his breath, he noticed something strange. The whispers had stopped, but the silence wasn't complete. Beneath the surface, faint and almost imperceptible, he thought he heard the faint echo of a heartbeat. Michael's relief was fleeting. The faint heartbeat seemed to resonate beneath the earth itself, growing stronger with each passing moment. He exchanged a glance with Emma, who sat trembling beside him, her pale face reflecting exhaustion and fear. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, her eyes wide. "It's still here, Michael. It's not over." He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "No, we destroyed the mirror. We broke the heart. This has to be something else." Emma shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. That wasn't the end. That mirror, it was just the beginning." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "The beginning? What are you talking about?" Emma's voice cracked as she spoke, her tone laced with desperation. "The mirror wasn't the heart, Michael. It was a gateway. We didn't destroy it. We opened it." His stomach churned, the weight of her words sinking in. "No, that can't be right. I saw it shatter, and it unleashed whatever was inside," she interrupted, her voice trembling. The ground beneath them shuddered, a subtle vibration that sent ripples through the grass. Michael shot to his feet, pulling Emma up with him. "We need to move. Now." They stumbled away from the house, the distant sound of the heartbeat growing louder. It was rhythmic and deep, like the pulse of some colossal, unseen entity. The sky above them darkened unnaturally, swirling clouds blotting out the sun. As they reached the edge of the property, Michael stopped short. The air ahead shimmered like a heat wave, distorting the landscape beyond. He extended a cautious hand, and it passed through the invisible barrier with no resistance. But as his fingers brushed the other side, a cold, electric jolt shot up his arm. Emma grabbed his hand, pulling it back. "Don't. It's not safe. We can't just stand here," Michael said, his frustration boiling over. "We need to get away from this place." Emma looked around, her expression one of dawning horror. "I don't think we can." Michael followed her gaze and saw the truth. The house loomed behind them, but now it was different. The windows glowed faintly, and dark tendrils of mist curled outward, creeping across the ground like searching fingers. The boundary between the property and the outside world seemed to ripple, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. "We're trapped," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing sound of the heartbeat. Michael refused to accept it. "No, there has to be a way out. There's always a way out." He led Emma along the perimeter of the property, searching for any sign of an opening in the unseen barrier. But no matter which direction they turned, the boundary held firm, the shimmering distortion stretching endlessly in every direction. The heartbeat grew louder, its rhythm echoing in their chests. The ground began to tremble, and a low, guttural sound emanated from the house. A sound that was neither mechanical nor organic, but something far worse. Emma clutched Michael's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "It's waking up," she said, her voice shaking. "What's waking up?" he demanded, turning to face her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "The thing behind the door. The real heart. We didn't destroy it. We set it free." Before Michael could respond, the ground beneath them cracked with a deafening roar. Dark fissures spread across the earth, releasing plumes of black smoke that carried with them the same whispers he had hoped to leave behind. From the center of the property, near the house, something began to rise. At first, it was just a shadow, a mass of darkness that seemed to defy the light. But as it grew, it took on a shape, a form that was both alien and horrifyingly familiar. It was enormous, its body composed of writhing tendrils and jagged, angular protrusions that gleamed like obsidian. Its eyes, or what passed for them, glowed with an intense, burning light, and its mouth opened in a silent scream that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. Michael and Emma froze, paralyzed by the sheer presence of the creature. The whispers were deafening now, each one like a dagger to the mind. "We can't fight that," Emma said, her voice barely audible. Michael's mind raced. He didn't have a plan, didn't have a weapon, didn't even know what he was facing. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let it take them without a fight. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear threatening to consume him. Emma grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "No, Michael, you don't understand. This isn't something you can fight. It's not something you can stop." "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. Emma's gaze shifted to the house, now almost entirely consumed by the writhing mass of the creature. "We end it. For good this time." Michael followed her gaze, his stomach sinking. "You're saying we go back in there?" She nodded, her expression grim. "It's the only way." The creature let out a bone-rattling roar, its tendrils lashing out and tearing through the air. Michael took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Then let's end it." They turned toward the house, its monstrous transformation growing with each passing moment, and ran straight into the heart of the nightmare. The air around the house felt alive, heavy with the pulsing energy of the monstrous creature. Michael and Emma pushed forward, their bodies trembling with each step. The ground beneath their feet cracked and shifted, dark tendrils emerging from the soil like skeletal hands grasping for them. The front door of the house was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of shadows. It pulsed in rhythm with the deafening heartbeat, drawing them in like an irresistible force. "We have to go through," Michael said, gripping Emma's hand tightly. Emma hesitated, her wide eyes fixed on the churning darkness. "If we go in, there's no guarantee we'll come back out." Michael looked at her, his jaw clenched. "If we don't go in, that thing will consume everything. We don't have a choice." Taking a deep breath, Michael stepped into the vortex, pulling Emma with him. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a cold, suffocating pressure that seemed to strip away his very sense of self. The whispers were deafening here, screaming directly into his mind, but he pushed forward, refusing to let go of Emma's hand. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves back in the corridor. But it wasn't the same as before. The walls were alive, pulsing with dark veins that oozed a thick, black fluid. The air was dense and acrid, making it difficult to breathe. "Where do we go?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Michael scanned the corridor, his mind racing. The door they had opened earlier, the one that had led them into this nightmare, was gone. In its place was a narrow passage that seemed to twist and stretch endlessly into the distance. "We follow the whispers," Michael said grimly. The whispers were louder here, a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to emanate from deep within the passage. They moved cautiously, the ground beneath them soft and unsteady, like walking on flesh. As they progressed, the whispers began to form words, fragments of sentences that sent chills down Michael's spine. You cannot escape. It sees you. Give in. Michael shook his head, trying to block out the voices. Don't listen to them. They're trying to break us. Emma nodded, though her grip on his hand tightened. The passage opened into a massive chamber, its walls lined with grotesque statues that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. At the center of the room was an enormous door, far larger and more ornate than the one they had encountered before. Its surface was covered in the same glowing symbols, but now they pulsed with a sickly green light, synchronized with the ever-present heartbeat. That's it, Emma said, her voice barely audible. That's where it's coming from. Michael stepped forward, his heart pounding in time with the rhythmic thrum of the door. As he approached, the symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to burrow into his mind. What do we do? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Michael studied the door, his mind racing. If this is the heart, we destroy it. But how? Michael didn't have an answer. He searched the chamber, looking for anything he could use. His eyes landed on a jagged shard of black stone protruding from the ground near one of the statues. He ran to it, prying it loose with a grunt of effort. The shard was heavy and cold, its surface etched with faint symbols that glowed faintly as he held it. He turned back to the door, his resolve hardening. This has to work, he said, more to himself than to Emma. He approached the door, the shard held high. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of pleas, threats, and cries. Don't! You'll regret this. It will consume you. Michael ignored them, slamming the shard into the center of the door. The effect was immediate. The door let out an ear-splitting screech, the symbols flashing brightly before fading into darkness. The heartbeat faltered, then stopped altogether. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the walls of the chamber began to crumble. Michael turned to Emma, his voice urgent. We have to get out of here. Emma nodded, and they sprinted back toward the passage they had come through. But as they ran, the chamber seemed to collapse around them, the walls closing in like a living organism trying to trap them. Faster! Michael shouted, pulling Emma along. They reached the vortex just as the chamber collapsed completely. Throwing themselves into the swirling darkness, they were engulfed by the cold, suffocating void once again. When they emerged, they were outside the house, lying on the grass. The sky above them was clear, the oppressive darkness gone. The house itself was silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. Michael sat up, his chest heaving. Emma lay beside him, her face pale but alive. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael looked back at the house, his mind racing. The whispers were gone, and the heartbeat had ceased. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. I don't know, he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I don't think we'll ever know for sure. The silence that followed was unsettling, a void where the oppressive whispers and thundering heartbeat had once been. Michael and Emma sat in the grass, staring at the house as it loomed over them, its once pristine facade now marred with cracks and decay. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael's hands trembled as he gripped the black shard he had used to destroy the door. The symbols etched into its surface had faded completely, leaving it cold and lifeless in his grasp. What now? Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Michael didn't answer immediately. He stared at the house, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground despite the bright sunlight. Something about it still felt wrong. We leave, he said finally, his voice firm. We get as far away from this place as possible. Emma nodded, but she didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the house, her expression distant. What if it's not over? Michael glanced at her, the unease in her voice sending a chill down his spine. We did what we had to do. Whatever was in there, we stopped it. That's all we can do. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. But what if we didn't? What if it's just waiting? Michael didn't have an answer. The truth was, he shared her fear. The stillness of the house, the absence of the whispers, it all felt too deliberate, as if the silence itself was a warning. "We can't stay here," he said finally, standing and helping her to her feet. "Come on." They started toward the edge of the property, the boundary where the invisible barrier had trapped them before. With each step, Michael's heart pounded, half expecting to feel the electric jolt again. But when they reached the edge, there was nothing. The air was clear, the way open. Michael exhaled a shaky breath. "We're free." Emma hesitated, glancing back at the house one last time. "It doesn't feel like it." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go. The farther we get from this place, the better." They walked in silence, the weight of the ordeal hanging heavy between them. The path leading away from the house was overgrown and winding, the trees on either side thick and shadowy. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sunlight began to dim, the shadows stretching longer and darker. Michael frowned, glancing up at the sky. "It's getting dark fast," he muttered. Emma looked around, her brow furrowing. "I don't think it's just the sun." The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches resembling skeletal hands. The oppressive silence that had followed them since leaving the house was broken by a faint sound, soft, rhythmic, and unmistakable. The heartbeat. Michael stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold. "No!" Emma grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "It's still here, Michael. It followed us." The sound grew louder, echoing through the forest. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a low, guttural growl resonated in the distance. Michael spun around, his eyes darting through the shadows. "We have to keep moving. If we stop now, we're done for." Emma nodded, her breathing quick and shallow. Together, they broke into a run, the forest blurring around them. The heartbeat seemed to chase them, growing louder and more insistent with every step. As they ran, the ground shifted beneath them, the roots of the trees writhing like serpents. Michael stumbled but caught himself, pulling Emma forward as the forest seemed to come alive. "There's no end to this," Emma cried, her voice rising in panic. "Don't say that," Michael shouted, his grip tightening on her hand. "We'll find a way out." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the path ahead twisting and looping back on itself. The growling grew closer, and Michael caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, something massive and serpentine, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Keep running," he urged, his voice hoarse. They pushed forward, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creature behind them roared, its voice shaking the trees and sending waves of terror coursing through them. Michael's legs burned with exertion, and his vision blurred with sweat and exhaustion. Just as he thought he couldn't take another step, they burst through the tree-line and into a clearing. The sight before them stopped them in their tracks. It was the house, but this time it was different. The cracks and decay were gone, replaced by an even more pristine appearance than before. The windows glowed softly, and the door stood wide open, beckoning them inside. Emma's voice trembled as she spoke. "It's starting over." Michael stared at the house, his heart sinking. No, this isn't possible." The whispers returned, faint and insidious, weaving through the air like a poisonous fog. The heartbeat throbbed louder, coming from within the house, its rhythm pulling them forward. Emma turned to Michael, her eyes filled with tears. "What do we do now?" Michael's grip on the black shard tightened. His jaw clenched as he made his decision. "We finish it," he said, his voice resolute. "For real this time." He stepped toward the house, the oppressive air growing heavier with each step. Behind him, Emma hesitated for only a moment before following him into the darkness once more. The doorway yawned like a maw, swallowing them whole as they stepped inside. The atmosphere within the house was suffocating, denser than before. The walls were pristine again, but the air was wrong, thick and pulsating, like they were walking inside a living organism. Michael gripped the shard tightly, its once cold surface now warm, almost pulsing faintly in his hand. He glanced back at Emma, who clutched her arms tightly around herself, trembling but determined. "It wants us back here," Michael said, his voice echoing in the silence. "It's not done with us." Emma's voice was shaky, but she managed to reply, "Then let's not give it the chance to win." The hallway stretched before them, impossibly long. The faint sound of whispers began again, distant at first, like a radio station caught between frequencies. They exchanged a glance, but continued forward. With every step, the house seemed to warp around them. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting like lungs, and the floor shifted under their feet, softening with each step. The air grew colder, and the whispers became clearer, forming fragmented words. "Come closer. You cannot hide. You belong to me." The whispers turned into a sickly chorus, overlapping in a way that made Michael's head throb. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the voices seemed to burrow deeper into his mind. "This way," Emma said suddenly, grabbing his arm. Michael looked at her, confused. "How do you know?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on a faint glow at the end of the corridor. "I don't know how, but I feel it. That's where it is." Reluctantly, Michael followed her lead. The glow grew brighter as they approached, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words becoming clearer with each step. As they turned the corner, they found themselves in a vast, circular room that shouldn't have existed within the house's dimensions. The room was dominated by a massive, pulsating structure in the center, a heart. It was grotesque, its surface veined and glistening, and it beat in sync with the infernal rhythm they'd heard since the beginning. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's alive!" Michael stared at the monstrous thing, while rising in his throat. "This is it. This is what's been driving everything." The heart pulsed faster, its veins lighting up with a sickly green glow. The whispers became a cacophony, screaming and laughing and pleading all at once. Emma clutched Michael's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What do we do?" Michael held up the shard, its edges gleaming in the unnatural light. "We destroy it. For good this time." The heart let out a deep, guttural sound that shook the room as if it understood his intent. The walls around them began to ripple, tendrils emerging from the floor and ceiling, reaching for them. "Go!" Michael shouted, shoving Emma toward the heart. "We have to act now." Emma hesitated for only a second before running toward the grotesque structure. Michael followed, slashing at the tendrils with the shard. The black stone cut through them effortlessly, but more kept coming, writhing and lashing out like angry serpents. Emma reached the base of the heart, her hands trembling as she looked up at its massive form. "How do we destroy something like this?" "Use this." Michael tossed her the shard, the movement instinctive. Emma caught it, her eyes wide as the shard began to glow faintly in her hands. She hesitated, the whispers clawing at her mind, telling her to stop, to run, to give in. "Do it!" Michael shouted, slashing at another tendril. "Don't listen to them." Emma raised the shard high, the glowing symbols on its surface pulsing in time with the heart. With a cry, she drove the shard into the center of the heart, the impact sending a shockwave through the room. The heart let out a deafening screech, its surface splitting open as a torrent of dark liquid poured out. The whispers turned into agonized screams, the voices dissipating one by one. The room shook violently, the walls cracking and crumbling as the heart began to collapse in on itself. "Run!" Michael shouted, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her away. They sprinted back toward the corridor, the ground collapsing behind them. The house groaned as if in pain, its walls folding inward as the heart's destruction sent shockwaves through its very foundation. The vortex appeared ahead of them, the same swirling darkness that had brought them here. Without hesitation, they dove into it, the sensation of cold and pressure enveloping them once more. When they emerged, they were outside, lying in the grass. The house behind them was gone, completely vanished, leaving only a scorched, blackened patch of earth. Michael sat up, his chest heaving. He turned to Emma, who lay beside him, her face pale but alive. Did we do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael looked back at the empty space where the house had stood. The whispers were gone, and the air felt lighter, freer. "I think we did," he said, though his voice lacked certainty. Emma sat up, staring at the blackened ground. "Do you think it's really over?" Michael didn't answer. Deep down, he wasn't sure if something like this could ever truly be over. The silence that hung in the air was almost deafening, and for a moment, it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. Michael stared at the place where the house had been, his mind still reeling from everything they had experienced. The weight of what they had just faced, the horrors they had endured, pressed heavily on his chest. Emma sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the scorched earth, as if searching for any trace of the monstrosity that had once been. She hadn't said much since they'd escaped, and Michael didn't blame her. Words felt hollow after everything. Still, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. "Is it really gone?" he asked, his voice low. Emma didn't answer immediately, her gaze still distant. Then finally she spoke. "I don't know. It feels over, but..." She trailed off, her voice shaking. "Something about this still feels wrong." Michael's stomach churned, and he turned away from the empty space where the house had been. "I know what you mean." The air was still, but that stillness felt unnatural. The world around them was too quiet. No birds sang, no wind blew through the trees. Everything felt too calm, as if it were waiting for something to happen. "Maybe we should just leave," Emma suggested, standing up and brushing the dirt from her clothes. Michael glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Where would we go? What if it follows us again?" "I don't know," she said, her voice faltering. "But I can't stay here. It's like it's all connected to this place. I need to get away from it." Michael nodded slowly. "You're right. Let's just get as far from here as possible." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the unknown settling over them like a dark cloud. The thought of returning to the world they knew, to their lives before the nightmare had started, seemed impossible. Could they really go back to normal? Emma reached for Michael's hand, her fingers cold but firm as they intertwined. "I just want to feel safe again." Michael squeezed her hand, his heart heavy with the same desire. "We will. We have to believe that we can." They began walking, their footsteps muffled on the soft earth. But even as they moved away from the place, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering just beyond the edge of their perception. The trees around them grew denser as they walked, their branches reaching down like twisted fingers. The air grew thicker, and the path seemed to stretch on endlessly. It felt as though the forest itself were holding them captive, refusing to let them leave. Suddenly, Emma stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. Michael paused, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment, everything was still. Then faintly he heard it, the low, rhythmic sound like the heartbeat they had heard before. "No," Michael whispered, his voice filled with dread. "Not again." The sound was coming from all around them now, reverberating through the ground and vibrating in their bones. It was closer this time, more intense, as if the very earth itself was alive and pulsing with dark energy. Emma looked around in a panic. "It's not gone. It's still here." Michael's mind raced. They hadn't destroyed the heart completely. Perhaps it had been a trap all along. Perhaps it was never meant to die. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet cracked, and a deep, rumbling growl echoed from the depths of the earth. The ground trembled violently, and Michael barely had time to grab Emma's arm before they were knocked off their feet. The forest around them seemed to warp and twist, the trees twisting like rubber, bending and stretching in unnatural ways. Shadows crept across the land, thick and oppressive, as if the darkness itself were alive. The heartbeat grew louder and louder, reverberating through the air, shaking the very foundation of the earth. "Run!" Michael shouted, pulling Emma toward the thick trees. They had to get out of here. They had to escape whatever this was before it consumed them. But the forest seemed to close in on them, the trees narrowing, the shadows growing thicker. The heartbeat was deafening now, shaking the ground beneath them. And then, from the corner of his eye, Michael saw it, a shape in the darkness moving toward them. A figure. It was tall, twisted, and dripping with shadows, its form vaguely humanoid but distorted beyond recognition. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, the same color as the heart, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. Emma gasped, her face paling. "What is that?" "I don't know, but we need to run," Michael shouted, pulling her along with him. They stumbled through the trees, their hearts pounding in their chests. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure was always just behind them, its footsteps echoing in their ears, the heartbeat pulsing louder with each passing second. "Keep going," Michael yelled, fear surging through him. "We can't stop." Emma was struggling to keep up, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It's getting closer." Michael glanced behind them. The figure was no longer walking. It was running, moving faster than they could, its long, twisted limbs stretching unnaturally with each stride. "Emma!" Michael shouted, gripping her wrist. "We need to." But before he could finish his sentence, the world around them exploded in a blinding flash of light. The force of it knocked them both to the ground, and for a moment, the world went silent. The heartbeat stopped. The shadows froze. Michael opened his eyes slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He was lying in the grass again. The forest was gone. The figure was gone. The pulse had ceased. He blinked, confused, but then his gaze fell on Emma. She was gone. The empty space beside him seemed to stretch on forever. "No, no, no, no!" Michael scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged as panic surged through him. "Emma!" But there was no answer. The silence was absolute. Michael's heart thudded violently in his chest as the realization hit him. Emma was gone. He spun around, desperately scanning the empty space, but there was nothing, just the still, barren ground where the forest had once been, its twisted trees now nothing more than a memory. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice cracking, echoing through the silence. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, and began to run in circles, calling her name over and over again. The world around him seemed to blur as panic set in, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the more he searched, the more hopeless it seemed. There was nothing, no sign of her, no trace of the horror they had just escaped. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, unnervingly so. The absence of the shadows, the heartbeat, the creature, everything that had haunted them moments before, left him disoriented, as though he had stepped into a different reality. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums and made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. "Emma!" he screamed again, his voice raw with desperation. Nothing. His mind raced, each thought a blur of confusion and panic. Where had she gone? What had happened? He had heard the blast of light. Had it taken her? Was she trapped in some other place, some twisted version of reality? He felt a surge of anger and fear, a deep, primal instinct to fight whatever force had taken her from him. Clenching his fists, Michael turned his focus inward, forcing himself to calm the chaos in his mind. "Think," he muttered under his breath. "Think. There has to be a way to fix this. We can't be done yet." He looked around again, his eyes darting over the vast emptiness. For the first time, he noticed something strange. The ground, once scorched and cracked, was now smooth and clean. The air, once heavy with suffocating dread, felt eerily neutral, neither hot nor cold. He bent down, running his fingers over the ground where the forest had been. And then he felt it, a faint pulse, a vibration that started deep beneath the earth and traveled through the soil like a heartbeat. Michael froze, his eyes widening. It was the same rhythm, the same pulse that had haunted them since the beginning. It was here, right beneath his feet. Without thinking, He dropped to his knees, digging his hands into the earth. The pulse grew stronger with every movement, urging him forward, leading him to something hidden deep below. His hands scraped against dirt and rock, pulling up clumps of earth until, finally, his fingers brushed against something smooth, cold, and unmistakably unnatural. He pulled harder, his heart pounding in anticipation, until a jagged edge emerged from the ground, a shard of black stone, similar to the one he had used to destroy the heart. His eyes widened as the stone began to glow, faint at first, then steadily growing brighter. He reached for it with trembling hands, feeling a surge of energy as he wrapped his fingers around it. The pulse beneath him intensified, as if reacting to the stone's touch. Michael's mind raced as he realized what this meant. The heart had been destroyed, but the source of the darkness was not gone. It had simply shifted, burrowed deeper into the earth. And now it was calling him. "Emma," he whispered, a newfound determination in his voice. He couldn't lose her. Not again. Not after everything they had been through. He stood, clutching the stone tightly, and took a deep breath. The whispers, faint at first, began to resurface. Not from the air, but from within the very ground beneath him. Soft at first, just a murmur, but growing louder by the second, as if the earth itself were speaking to him. "Come back to me. Come closer." The voice was familiar, and yet it felt different. Darker. Twisted. Michael's blood ran cold as he realized what it was, what had always been speaking to them. This wasn't just the heart. This wasn't just a door. It was something older, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. With no time to lose, he set off, following the pulsing vibrations through the now empty land. The whispers grew louder, louder until they were almost deafening. They were everywhere, underneath the earth, inside his mind. And then, through the darkness, he saw it. A door. It stood alone in the middle of the barren field, its edges gleaming with an unnatural light. The door was old, ancient even, but perfectly preserved. There was no frame around it, just the door, standing against the emptiness. Michael's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary door. This was the same door. The one they had seen before. The one that had called them. The one they had barely escaped from. But this time it was different. The whispers were clearer now, and they were coming from beyond the door, urging him to step forward. "Come to me. Come and see." "Emma," Michael whispered again, stepping forward, his mind racing with every step. "I'll find you." He reached the door and placed his hand on the cold, smooth surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the door shuddered, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. For a moment, everything was still. Then slowly the door creaked open. Beyond it lay darkness, an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was thick with malice, the darkness swirling with tendrils of shadow, as if something was waiting for him to enter. Michael hesitated, but only for a moment. He had to go in. He couldn't leave Emma out there, trapped in whatever nightmare this place had created. With a steadying breath, he stepped through the door, and the world dissolved around him. The moment Michael stepped through the door, everything around him seemed to collapse into darkness. The air grew thick, cold, and suffocating. He could barely see, his vision blurred by the oppressive blackness, and yet, the weight of the silence around him felt even heavier than before. His breath came in shallow gasps, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He stumbled forward, his footfalls echoing in the void, but there was no path, no sense of direction. Just a vast emptiness that stretched on endlessly. His mind raced with questions. Where was Emma? Was she here? What was this place? The whispers were louder now. They seemed to come from every direction, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. "You've come. You always come. Come closer." Michael's grip tightened on the shard of black stone he still held. It pulsed in his hand, a strange energy radiating from it. He felt its power, its ancient darkness, calling to him. For a brief moment, he wondered if this was truly the right path, if he was meant to go deeper into this nightmare. But then he remembered Emma. He couldn't stop. "Emma!" he shouted into the dark. His voice cracked, echoing back at him, swallowed by the vast, empty space. There was no answer. The whispers only grew louder, drowning out his own thoughts. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep moving. The shard's pulse in his hand seemed to grow in intensity, urging him forward. Ahead, through the murk of the darkness, a faint glow appeared. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but then it began to brighten, growing stronger, warmer. It wasn't just a light. It was a doorway, a door that beckoned him. Michael's heart pounded harder in his chest, every muscle in his body screaming for him to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Not when Emma was somewhere ahead, waiting for him. He approached the glowing door cautiously, every step slow and deliberate. As he drew closer, the whispering voices grew more urgent, more frantic, as if the door itself were alive, pulsing with energy, with intent. Come and see. Open the door." The voices were no longer just whispers. They were words, words that pierced his thoughts and twisted his mind. His hand reached out, trembling, to touch the door's handle. The second his fingers made contact, the door shuddered, as if recognizing his touch. A cold wind howled through the void, pushing against him, but he pushed forward, unwilling to be deterred. With a final, determined pull, he opened the door. Beyond it was a room, a dim, flickering room filled with shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The walls were made of stone, ancient and worn, etched with symbols that Michael couldn't recognize. But there was something familiar about it, something that gnawed at his memory. In the center of the room stood a figure. Emma. She was standing motionless, her eyes wide, her face pale. She didn't look like herself. She looked distant, unseeing. "Emma!" Michael cried, rushing forward. But as he took a step, the room seemed to shift. The walls bent in impossible angles, the shadows swirling around him like living things, their tendrils reaching toward him. "Don't touch her. She belongs to us now." Michael's blood ran cold. He froze, his eyes locked on Emma. The shadows around her were thickening, closing in, and she didn't move, didn't react. It was as though she were trapped, locked in some sort of trance. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared ahead, but there was no recognition in them. No sign of the woman he had fought so hard to protect. "Emma!" Michael shouted again, his voice hoarse with panic. But this time, the shadows reacted. They recoiled, as though repelled by his words, but the air thickened, darkened, and Michael could feel the temperature drop drastically. It felt like the room itself was pressing in on him, suffocating him. The whispers were louder now, overwhelming his senses. "You should have never come back. You should have never opened the door. She is ours now." The last whisper was the loudest, the most forceful, and it hit Michael like a physical blow. His head spun, his knees almost buckling under the weight of it. He reached out toward Emma, but as his hand neared her, the shadows lashed out like claws, striking at him, forcing him back. He stumbled, falling to the ground, his body bruised and aching. The shadows receded momentarily, but the room had changed. It was no longer just a room, it was a prison. The walls began to close in on him, the ceiling lowering, the floor shaking. The door behind him had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. There was no way out. But still he couldn't give up. "Emma!" he screamed again, his voice cutting through the suffocating darkness. "I won't leave you here." The shadows around Emma writhed, as if they were alive, responding to his words. They reached out toward her, curling around her limbs, pulling her into the center of the room. "No!" Michael cried, scrambling to his feet. He charged toward her, the shard gripped tightly in his hand, its glow now more intense, more forceful. He raised it high, ready to strike at the shadows, to break their hold on her. But as he took a step forward, something stopped him. The figure in the center of the room, the one who had been Emma, shifted. The darkness around her began to move, twisting, forming into something else, something wrong. The face, the features, the body, None of it was Emma anymore. It was a distortion, a reflection of something darker. It grinned at him, its smile stretching unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. "You should have stayed away, Michael." Michael's breath caught in his throat as the figure before him grinned, its mouth twisting into a grotesque mockery of Emma's face. The shadows that had once clung to her now writhed and pulsed, transforming her into something unrecognizable. The woman he had come to save was gone, replaced by this thing. He could barely hold his gaze on it, the twisted smile haunting his every thought. The thing spoke, its voice a jarring mixture of Emma's familiar tone and something darker, something much older. "You came too late, Michael." The words felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. "She's ours now, just like everyone else who wandered too close." Michael's fingers tightened around the shard of black stone in his hand. It was pulsing with an almost frantic energy now, vibrating violently, as if it were alive. The glow from the stone cast strange shadows across the walls, making the room feel even more oppressive. The stone in his hand seemed to be pulling him forward, urging him to act, to do something, anything to save Emma. But what could he do? How could he fight this? He had no answers, only desperation. "Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking as he looked at the creature in front of him, the thing that wore her face. "Please come back. You don't belong to it. I won't leave you like this." The thing that had once been Emma tilted its head slightly, its eyes, if they could still be called eyes, narrowing with mock sympathy. "You still don't understand, do you?" The shadows around it reached out like tendrils, grabbing at the air and pulling the room tighter, closer. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the shadows' movements became more frantic, almost frantic, like they were preparing for something. "We are part of it now," the creature continued, its voice now layered with something deeper, more powerful. "The door, the whispers, they've always been here, waiting for someone like you, someone who wouldn't be able to resist. You came because you wanted to, Michael." Michael staggered back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just some otherworldly force. It had been waiting for someone to open the door, waiting for someone to make the choice to step into the darkness. "And now you're mine." The creature's grin widened, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. The shadows thickened around Emma, pulling her closer to the center of the room, where the air itself seemed to bend, twisted and warped. Michael's heart raced faster, and an overwhelming wave of fear washed over him. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything. And then it caught his gaze. The symbols carved into the stone walls, they weren't just random etchings. They were patterns that shifted and twisted the moment he looked away, almost like they were alive. They seemed to pulse in time with the heartbeat that still thudded somewhere deep beneath the room. Michael's mind snapped to the shard in his hand. Could it be? Could the stone, the black stone he held, could it be the key to stopping all of this? Without another moment's hesitation, he moved forward. The whispers were louder now, a deafening roar in his ears, urging him to stop, to run, to give in. But he gritted his teeth, his hands trembling as he held the shard above his head. "I won't let you have her," he screamed, his voice hoarse from the strain. The moment the shard touched the air in front of him, a burst of light erupted from it, blinding in its intensity. The room quaked violently, the walls shaking and cracking as the light spread like wildfire, chasing away the shadows. The creature hissed in pain, its face contorting as if the light itself burned it. "No, you cannot stop us," it screeched, its form flickering as though the darkness could no longer hold its shape. The grin faltered, and the thing that had been Emma twisted in agony, its voice now a high-pitched wail of pure anguish. Michael pushed forward, fueled by the thought of Emma, his Emma, trapped within this monstrous illusion. He slammed the shard of stone into the floor, its energy now coursing through the ground like a current, sending waves of light and heat crashing through the room. The room began to crack and shatter around him, the walls buckling under the pressure of the forces at work. The shadows screeched, their forms splintering like broken glass. And then, just as the creature let out a final, desperate shriek, everything went silent. The darkness dissolved like mist in the morning sun, and the room, what was left of it, collapsed into nothing. For a long, breathless moment, Michael stood frozen in place. His heart was racing, his legs weak beneath him, and his hand still gripped the shard, which had gone cold in his palm. He looked around, half expecting the room to come back together, for the nightmare to start all over again. But it didn't. There was nothing. The world was still, silent, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. A shape, a movement. It was Emma. Michael's heart surged, and he stumbled toward her, his breath shaky, his vision blurring with relief and fear. She was standing there, her eyes vacant but alive, her form solid and whole. "Emma?" he called softly, reaching for her. She didn't respond at first, her eyes unfocused, as if she were in a daze. Then finally she blinked, and her gaze cleared. She looked at him, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. "Michael," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. I'm here. I'm back." Michael's throat tightened as he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. For a moment, he simply breathed, relief washing over him in waves. She was real. She was here. But as he held her, a dark thought lingered at the edge of his mind. The door, the whispers, the force that had been behind everything. Was it really over? Or was this just another moment before the darkness returned? He shook the thought away for now. For now they were together. For now they were safe. But he knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It never was. Michael held Emma tightly, the weight of what they had just endured pressing down on him. He could feel the warmth of her body in his arms, the steady rise and fall of her breath as she clung to him. But a nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't let him relax. They had been through so much, faced horrors they couldn't even begin to understand, and yet the silence around them felt wrong. He glanced around the room again, his eyes scanning the empty space. The darkness had lifted, but something still lingered. The air, though still, felt thick with something unspoken, something waiting. "Emma," he whispered, pulling away slightly to look at her. Are you okay?" His voice trembled as he asked, knowing the question didn't really cover everything. There were things unsaid, things that hung heavy in the air. She nodded slowly, but her expression was distant, like she was still trying to piece together what had happened, as if she hadn't fully returned from wherever the shadows had taken her. I don't know," she murmured, her voice shaky. "It's like I was there, but I couldn't move, couldn't think." Her eyes flickered, glancing around the empty room before settling back on him. "Michael, I felt lost, like I didn't belong there anymore." Michael's heart sank. He knew what she meant. He had felt the same thing during those moments, when the darkness had swallowed everything. They had been close to something that wasn't just evil, it was ancient. A force that had seen things no living creature should ever experience. And it was still out there somewhere waiting. "We need to go," he said, his voice low, urgency creeping into his tone. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay. Not with that thing. I don't know what it is, Emma, but it's not over." She didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with the same unease that had taken root in his own heart. They turned, and Michael stepped toward the only exit, a narrow archway at the far side of the room. He reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing against the stone. It was cold, too cold, as if it had been frozen in time. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pushed forward, determined not to let fear win. But as they approached the arch, a low, almost imperceptible sound echoed through the room. It was a hum at first, faint, like a whisper on the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it became a constant thrum that rattled the very air around them. Michael froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice a mere breath, as though speaking louder might invite whatever it was closer. He turned to Emma, and the fear in her eyes mirrored his own. The sound was coming from somewhere deep within the walls, like a heartbeat, like something alive, pulsing and growing. And then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A low rumble shook the room, and the shadows, which had been absent moments before, began to stretch and twist along the walls once again. They moved like living things, slithering up the stone, gathering in the corners, creeping toward the center of the room. "Michael," Emma gasped, her voice breaking. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. He didn't have the words. All he knew was that they needed to get out, and fast. The air was thick now, suffocating, and the stone walls were starting to crack and groan, as if they were alive, as if the room itself were trying to trap them again. The shadows converged in the center of the room, thickening until they formed a mass, a swirling vortex of darkness that pulled in everything around it. The room seemed to pulse with a rhythm now, like a heart that had started to beat once more. "Run!" Michael shouted, grabbing Emma's hand and yanking her toward the archway. They bolted, stumbling over the uneven ground, their feet barely keeping up with the ground that seemed to shift beneath them. The walls of the room shuddered with every step they took, the sound of grinding stone echoing in their ears. The shadows were everywhere now, reaching out with long, tendril-like arms, scraping at the floor as they swirled toward the center. They were close, just a few more steps. Then the archway, the only way out, collapsed. A massive crack split the stone, and the doorway was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of swirling shadows. The very air seemed to close in on them, squeezing the breath from their lungs. "No!" Michael screamed, his voice breaking with panic. He scrambled back, his eyes darting around, searching for another escape, but there was nothing. The room was closing in on them. The shadows, those dark, malevolent things, seemed to draw closer, surrounding them, coiling around their legs, their arms. Then, amidst the darkness, a voice emerged, a voice that wasn't Emma's, but something far older, far more sinister. "You should have left when you had the chance." The voice slithered into Michael's mind, and he felt his resolve falter. It was like a cold, suffocating presence wrapping around his thoughts, crushing his will. It felt like the room itself was speaking, its very being a twisted reflection of all the horrors that had existed before them. "Michael," Emma's voice broke through the darkness, shaking with fear. She clutched at his arm, and he turned to look at her. Her face was pale, but there was something else in her eyes now, a flicker of something deeper, something ancient. The same darkness that had claimed her earlier seemed to be swirling within her, too, twisting her features, pulling at her soul. "She's ours," the voice whispered again, this time louder, sharper, as if the room itself were laughing. "Emma!" Michael shouted, his panic escalating as he looked at her. "Don't listen to it. You're stronger than this." But Emma's eyes were unfocused, distant. She took a step back from him, her hand slipping away. The shadows reached out toward her, like they were calling her name, pulling her in. "No, no, no," Michael murmured, reaching for her. "Emma!" But it was too late. The shadows enveloped her in an instant, and with a scream that echoed through the room, Emma vanished into the darkness. Michael fell to his knees, his chest heaving with sobs of desperation. He had failed. He had promised he wouldn't leave her behind, and now she was gone. "It's not over yet, Michael." Michael's heart raced in his chest as the room fell silent again. The darkness seemed to pull away slightly, but the air was thick with a tension that refused to leave. He could still hear Emma's voice echoing in his mind, her scream, the way it had torn through him, and yet she was gone. The shadows that had swallowed her didn't retreat. They lingered, swirling around the space where she had been. Michael's chest tightened as he stood slowly, wiping away the sweat from his brow. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as though the room itself was still alive, shifting beneath him. The stone was cold, colder than before, and every breath he took seemed to freeze in his lungs. "Don't give up, Michael." The voice, distant yet chilling, wrapped around his thoughts again. "There is more to do, more to be seen. The door hasn't closed yet. His head snapped up, eyes wide. He hadn't imagined it. The whisper had come again, clearer this time. There was something else in the room now, something that wasn't just an echo of the horrors that had passed. It was a call. The shadows shifted once more, retreating into the corners like reluctant servants. Michael could feel the oppressive weight in the air slowly lifting, but it didn't bring relief. It brought something else, something dangerous. "Find the door," the voice urged, its words vibrating through the stone. "The truth lies behind it, and you must see it before it sees you." Michael's throat went dry. The door, the one that had led him here, the one he had destroyed. Could it still exist? Had it always been here, waiting for him to open it? Without thinking, he reached for the shard in his hand, the black stone that had been his only defense so far. It felt cold in his grip, but as his fingers tightened, a faint pulse of energy hummed through it, almost like it was alive. He had used it before, but this time, something was different. It wasn't just an object, it was a part of this place. The voice in his mind wasn't satisfied with his hesitation. "Hurry," it whispered more urgently now. "Time is running out." With a start, Michael turned back to the far corner of the room. He had no idea what he was doing, but something within him told him to go there, to where it all had started. As he approached the wall, the shadows seemed to bend toward him, as though they were following his every move. He could feel their pull, their hunger. The walls groaned as though they were alive, reacting to his presence. He pressed the shard of black stone against the cold surface, and it seemed to melt into the stone as if it had never been solid to begin with. There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then the stone began to shift. The sound of cracking stone echoed through the room as something was breaking through. Michael stepped back, heart pounding in his chest. The shadows receded, their presence now almost a whisper in the far corners of the room. The wall before him trembled, as though it was waking from a long slumber. And then, with a final resounding crack, the stone wall split open, revealing another door. It wasn't like the door he had seen before. This one was different. It was larger, grander, more ornate, with twisted carvings that seemed to writhe and shift as if they were alive. The whispers were louder now, no longer just faint voices in his head. They were real, coming from behind the door, insistent and beckoning. "Come." The voice was stronger now, commanding. "It's time to finish what you started." Michael hesitated, his body frozen with fear. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to leave, to never open that door. But the pull was undeniable. The stone still pulsed in his hand, urging him forward, guiding him toward whatever lay beyond. With a deep, shuddering breath, Michael stepped forward. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the door was drawing all the life from the room. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the door. For a moment, he considered turning back, but there was no way out, no way but forward. He pushed it open. The door creaked as it swung wide, revealing a vast, darkened space beyond. The room was empty, yet it felt as though it was filled with a presence. Something ancient, something all-consuming, watching from the edges of his vision. He stepped inside cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him like a storm. He couldn't understand the words, but they were there, filling his mind with images of things he could not process. Flickers of faces, shadows, glimpses of horrors that were too vile to comprehend. "Emma," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Where are you?" The air in the room shifted, and for a brief, fleeting moment he saw her. Not the creature that had taken her, but his Emma. Her face appeared before him, her eyes wide with terror. "Michael!" Her voice was faint, desperate. "It's too late." Before he could reach out to her, the vision flickered and vanished. The room was silent once again. The shadows seemed to be drawing closer, closing in on him. "It's not too late." The voice echoed, dark and insistent. "Not yet. You've only just begun to see. There is so much more to discover." Michael's hands clenched into fists as he took a step forward. There had to be something here. There had to be a way to end this nightmare. He wouldn't let it win. Not after everything he'd been through. And then he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. Behind him, the door slammed shut. The walls of the room trembled as if something huge was moving through them. The shadows flickered, shifting in time with a rhythmic pulse that filled the air. And then, from the depths of the room, a new sound broke through the whispers. A low, guttural growl. Michael turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. The darkness ahead of him shifted, and something moved. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the growl echoed through the room. The shadows in the far corner twisted violently, as though they were being disturbed by something far larger than he could comprehend. His heartbeat was deafening in his ears, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to escape this place. But the door behind him was now sealed, and the shadows had started to close in around him, almost like they were alive, like they were hunting him. The growl grew louder, more menacing, as something massive began to take shape within the darkness. The shadows writhed and shifted, coalescing into a grotesque figure. Michael's eyes went wide as the creature emerged fully from the darkness, a towering monstrosity, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the shadows, its form almost impossible to describe. It seemed to be a mass of darkness, with tendrils reaching out from it, twisting like writhing snakes. Its face was an amalgamation of sharp, jagged edges, as if it had been carved from the deepest nightmares. And as it stepped forward, a voice, deep, guttural, and filled with malice, rumbled through the air. "You should have stayed away." The words were like a heavy weight pressing against Michael's chest. The voice resonated deep within his bones, shaking him to his core. He could feel the power of the creature radiating from it, almost suffocating him, and every part of him wanted to run. But his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, caught in the creature's gaze. It took a slow, deliberate step toward him, the shadows crawling at its feet like they were eager to follow its every movement. "You are too late," the creature hissed, its voice slithering through the air. "Everything you have seen, everything you have felt, is only the beginning. This place is mine, and now, so are you." Michael shook his head, trying to tear his eyes away from the creature. His mind raced, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just some haunting, some ghostly apparition. This was something ancient, something that had been waiting for him, waiting for someone. He could hear Emma's voice again in his mind, faint and distant. "Michael, listen to me," she whispered, her voice breaking through the suffocating darkness. "You have to fight. You can't let it win." Her words sparked something inside him, a flicker of hope amidst the crushing despair. His hands clenched into fists, and his pulse quickened. He had to do something. Anything. The creature's eyes narrowed, and its monstrous form seemed to loom larger, if that was even possible. It laughed, a low, menacing sound that seemed to vibrate through Michael's entire body. "Fight!" The creature's voice dripped with amusement. "You cannot fight me, little man. I am beyond fighting. I am beyond all of you." Michael's mind raced, looking for any escape, anything that could save him. His eyes darted to the walls of the room. The stone was cracked, but it was solid. There was no way out through the walls. The floor was the same, unyielding. But there, in the center of the room, where the creature now stood, was something else. Something strange. A faint glimmer of light in the middle of the darkness. Michael's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the creature's chest, a symbol, glowing faintly like an eye watching him. It pulsed with light, and Michael's gaze locked on it. "It's a weakness," he thought to himself, the words forming in his mind like a revelation. The creature's growl echoed through the room again, and it took another step closer to him, its red eyes burning with malice. "You think you can stop me?" The creature hissed. "You think you can take me down? You are nothing. I am eternal. I am the one who holds the door, the one who watches over all that lies within." The air grew even colder, the shadows wrapping around Michael like cold fingers, creeping up his legs, pulling at him. He gasped, feeling the pressure building in his chest as the creature continued to advance. He needed to act. Fast. Without thinking, Michael reached for the shard of black stone still clutched tightly in his hand. He raised it toward the creature, the pulse of energy that had surged through it earlier still thrumming beneath his fingers. The moment the stone was raised, the creature's eyes widened, its growl turning into an almost inaudible hiss. The shadows around Michael recoiled, as if afraid of the shard's presence. "What are you doing?" The creature snarled, its form flickering for a moment, like it was struggling to hold its shape. "That won't save you." Michael pressed forward, his hand shaking, but his resolve firm. He was terrified, utterly terrified, but he couldn't back down now. This was the only chance he had. He raised the shard higher, focusing all his energy on the faint light glowing from the creature's chest. With a yell of desperation, he thrust the shard toward the creature, aiming straight for the symbol embedded in its chest. The moment the stone made contact, the room seemed to explode in a burst of blinding light. The creature screamed, a sound so horrific, so filled with rage and agony, that it reverberated through every fiber of Michael's being. The light grew brighter, more intense, and for a moment, Michael thought he might be blinded, consumed by the force of it. But then the scream stopped. The light faded. The creature was gone. The room fell into silence. For a long moment, Michael stood there, staring at the spot where the creature had been. His heart pounded in his chest, and his body was trembling with adrenaline. The shadows that had filled the room were now gone, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. And yet, something didn't feel right. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the empty space. He had defeated the creature, yes, but there was still a lingering sense of something wrong. A feeling that wouldn't leave him, no matter how hard he tried to shake it. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no answer. The silence in the room stretched out, suffocating and thick. Michael's heart still pounded in his chest, each beat ringing louder in his ears. He felt the faintest tremor in his limbs, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving him weak and hollow. The room, once filled with the terrifying presence of the creature, now felt almost too quiet. His eyes darted around the space. The shadows had receded completely, and the air was no longer so heavy with dread. It was as if the worst had passed, and yet, a part of Michael felt an uneasy emptiness. It was a strange, unnatural stillness, like the calm after a storm that hadn't truly ended. He took a cautious step forward, his body still on edge, every nerve taut. "Emma!" The name echoed in his mind, and for a brief moment, he thought he could hear her whispering to him. But there was no sound, no sign of her presence. Michael clenched his fists, frustration surging through him. "Where are you?" He glanced at the door that had been his entry point into this nightmare, the door that had led him into this room, the place where the creature had come from. The door had sealed itself when the creature had appeared, but now it was different. It was no longer the solid, imposing door he had seen before. The air around it shimmered, as if the door itself was somehow alive, breathing softly in the darkness. Michael's breath caught. Could it be? He slowly moved towards the door, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the cold metal. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a jolt of energy shot through him, making his skin prickle. He gasped, pulling his hand back in shock, but the door didn't open. It pulsed again, and for a moment, Michael could have sworn he felt something watching him from the other side. Suddenly, a voice whispered, low and insistent, inside his head. "Go back. Leave now. It's not over." The voice was familiar, but faint. Too faint. Michael's eyes darted to the shadows, but they had retreated, leaving only the glistening walls. The room was empty, or so it seemed. He felt cold, a bone-deep chill, the same feeling that had crept into him when the creature had first appeared. He wasn't alone. The voice came again, louder this time, no longer a whisper but a sharp, almost frantic command. "Leave the door." Before Michael could react, the door suddenly swung open, seemingly of its own accord. The air in the room grew colder still, the temperature dropping as though something from the depths of the earth had risen. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but his legs felt rooted to the floor. He was drawn to the open door, not by curiosity, but by something much stronger, a pull that he couldn't resist. The shadows seemed to crawl up the walls, whispering in his ears, their words now indistinct, lost in a strange, unholy language that only added to the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. Michael's breath quickened as he stepped toward the doorway. Every instinct told him to stop, but his mind, exhausted and fractured, couldn't comprehend what was happening. His body moved as if controlled by something else, a force greater than his own will. The door opened wider, and the scene beyond it was nothing like he expected. It was dark, darker than the room he had just left. But there was something familiar about it. It was a space that seemed to stretch on forever, like a vast, endless hall of stone. But it wasn't the size that chilled Michael to his core. No, it was the feeling that he had seen it before. The walls were lined with ancient, decaying portraits. Faces that looked at him with hollow eyes, their expressions frozen in eternal sorrow. There was something deeply wrong with the figures in the paintings, something about their eyes that made Michael's skin crawl. Their eyes followed him, tracking his every movement. As he stepped through the door, the air seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped even further. The light was dim, but there was an unnatural glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls, the floor, everything was made of the same ancient stone he had encountered earlier. But then, just as he was about to take another step, the whispers returned. They were louder now, almost deafening, rushing through his mind with a cold, maddening urgency. "You shouldn't be here. You cannot leave. You cannot fight what is coming." The words shattered Michael's already fragile resolve. His eyes darted around, the oppressive presence closing in on him. There was something moving in the shadows, a figure standing still watching him. He couldn't see its face, but the feeling it gave off was unmistakable. It was the same feeling he had when he had first seen the creature. "It's not over." The door behind him slammed shut, and the shadows gathered closer, suffocating him. He reached out, his hands shaking, trying to find a way back to where he had come from, but there was no escape. Not now. The figure in the shadows took a step toward him, and in the dim light, Michael saw it clearly for the first time. It was another creature, but this one was different. Its form was barely human, a twisted amalgamation of flesh and bone, and its eyes gleamed with an ancient, malevolent hunger. "You are too late," it hissed, its voice cold and full of venom. "You've opened the door, and now you are ours." The shadows seemed to close in, suffocating him. Michael's legs gave way beneath him as he collapsed onto the stone floor, his chest tight with fear. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness was swallowing him. And then, from the depths of the room, the voice came again, louder, more insistent. "It's not over." Michael's pulse hammered in his ears, louder than the growls and whispers surrounding him. He was shaking, feeling every bone in his body tremble under the weight of the nightmare closing in. His eyes scanned the room, desperate to find something, anything, that could help him escape, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive darkness, and the figure slowly advancing toward him. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the final strike. The creature's form twisted unnaturally, its limbs stretching and contorting as though it didn't quite belong to this world. Michael's breath hitched as the creature's glowing red eyes locked onto his, and the hunger in them was palpable. "You think you can escape?" The voice was chilling, full of contempt. "There is no escape. There is nothing but this." Michael scrambled backward, his hands scraping against the cold, smooth stone floor as he tried to push himself away from the figure. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move. His body refused to cooperate, each movement sluggish and weak, as if it was no longer his own. The creature loomed over him now, towering, its shadow swallowing him whole. A cold laugh escaped its lips, echoing through the room like a distant, mocking sound. "You thought you could defeat me?" The creature jeered. "Foolish. You are nothing." Michael's breath caught in his throat as the air grew thick, choking him. His vision began to blur, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. But then the whisper, soft and desperate, broke through the haze of fear that had clouded his mind. "Michael!" His heart skipped a beat. "Emma!" The whisper was so faint, but it was unmistakable. He heard her voice again, trembling, fragile. "Michael, please!" The sound of her name brought a surge of adrenaline through his veins. It was all he needed. With renewed strength, Michael pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting the movement, but he didn't care. He couldn't stop now. Not after everything. The figure before him seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, as though it sensed the change in Michael. "You are making a mistake," it warned, its voice dripping with malice. "There is no escape. You belong to this place now." Michael's eyes darted around the room, his mind racing, trying to piece together any possible way out. The walls were lined with those disturbing portraits, the hollow eyes of the figures following his every movement. But his gaze landed on something that had previously eluded him, the faint glow emanating from one of the portraits. It was small, subtle, but Michael recognized it. The symbol. The same symbol he had seen in the creature's chest. The glowing mark pulsed with energy, almost like a heartbeat. "This is it," he thought. "This is the key." He moved quickly, ignoring the pain that shot through his limbs, ignoring the suffocating weight of the shadows that still clung to him. He approached the portrait with trembling hands, the whispers growing louder as he drew closer. "No!" The creature hissed, its voice sharp with rage. "Do not touch it!" Michael reached out, his fingers brushing against the glowing symbol. The moment his skin made contact with the stone, the room seemed to lurch. The air around him shifted, becoming heavier and more oppressive. He could hear the creature's growl, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor beneath him. And then, in an instant, the world around him shattered. The shadows seemed to explode, scattering into a million pieces, leaving behind a blinding light. Michael shut his eyes, his hands raising instinctively to shield himself from the overwhelming brilliance. "No!" the creature screeched. "This is not the way." But Michael didn't stop. He pressed harder, his hand forcing the symbol deeper into the wall. The light grew brighter, filling the room with an intensity that burned his eyes. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. For a brief moment, Michael thought he had lost consciousness. But when he opened his eyes again, the world around him was different. The oppressive shadows were gone. The weight on his chest had lifted, and the air felt clean. He was standing in the same room, but it was no longer the same. The walls were no longer covered in strange, glowing symbols, and the haunting portraits had disappeared. The stone floor beneath his feet was cracked, but there was no sign of the creature, no sign of the darkness that had once surrounded him. Michael took a tentative step forward, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. Had he done it? Had he somehow broken free? He turned, half expecting to see the creature looming behind him, but there was nothing. No shadows, no whispers, no growls, just silence. It was over, but the silence felt wrong. "Emma!" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the empty echoes of his own words bouncing off the walls. His heart sank. "Emma, where are you?" A sudden movement caught his eye. He turned, heart racing again, but it was only a shadow in the corner of the room. For a moment, he thought it might be the creature, but as he looked closer, he saw something else. A figure, a person, standing still, facing away from him. The figure's posture was familiar, but he couldn't make out the details. "Emma!" Michael whispered, his voice barely a breath. The figure didn't move. His hands shook as he took a step closer, and then another. "Emma!" The figure slowly turned around. It was her. But it wasn't the Emma he remembered. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, hollow, like the figures in the portraits. Her lips were cracked, her expression cold and vacant. No. Michael's heart skipped a beat as a chill ran down his spine. This wasn't his Emma. This wasn't her. And before he could react, the figure opened its mouth and her voice came out. But it wasn't the soft, comforting tone he remembered. No, this voice was darker. You should never have come here. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the figure in front of him spoke. The voice was unmistakably Emma's, yet twisted, warped beyond recognition. It echoed in his mind, carrying with it an eerie sense of finality. Every part of him wanted to turn and flee, but his feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the weight of the words. You should never have come here. The words stung him, cutting through his chest like icy blades. He reached out, his hands trembling as he tried to take a step closer to the figure. His voice cracked when he spoke, desperation creeping into every syllable. Emma, what's happening? What's going on? His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. The figure did not respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, its empty eyes locking with his. There was something in those eyes, something familiar, yet distant. As if Emma's essence was trapped in there, struggling to break free, but something else was now in control. You've unlocked something, the figure whispered, its lips barely moving. Something that cannot be undone. Michael recoiled, his mind racing. What do you mean? I stopped it. I destroyed the creature. You did not destroy it. The voice was colder now, and with it came a dark, suffocating presence that filled the room. It was never about the creature. It was never about defeating it. It was about you, about your choices. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, a cruel, hollow expression. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The smile was not Emma's. It was something else, something twisted, something inhuman. What do you mean, my choices? His voice was raw, a mixture of confusion and panic. What are you trying to say? Emma, please. The figure's hollow eyes widened for just a second, a brief flash of recognition passing through them before they became lifeless again. You were meant to walk this path, it continued, the words slithering through the air like poison. You were always meant to unlock the door. This was your fate. Fate? Michael echoed, his voice trembling. No, this isn't my fate. This isn't Emma. You're not her. The figure's laughter rang out, hollow and empty, echoing against the walls, reverberating in his skull. It felt like the room was closing in on him, the walls pressing against him, as if the space itself were alive, watching, listening. Oh, but you are wrong, Michael. The voice was almost pitying now, like a parent trying to console a child who couldn't understand. You are here because you were meant to be here. This was always going to happen. You could not fight it. You could not change it. Michael staggered backward, his mind in a frenzy, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Emma, couldn't be anything like the woman he loved. No, this isn't true. His voice cracked, desperation seeping into his words. I've been through too much to just give in. You can't make me believe this. The figure's eyes darkened, and the smile faded. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a bone-chilling cold that seeped deep into Michael's skin, making his teeth chatter. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. And then, with a sudden lurch, the figure lunged forward. It moved so quickly that Michael had no time to react. His heart skipped a beat as cold fingers closed around his wrist, pulling him toward the shadowy corner of the room. He tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong, too unnatural. The strength behind the hand was overwhelming, and no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. You cannot run from it, the figure whispered into his ear, its voice now a low, unsettling rasp. You cannot outrun your destiny. It is too late for you, Michael. You belong here. Forever. The coldness that enveloped him seemed to seep into his bones, freezing him to the core. He could feel the energy draining from him, as though his very life force was being siphoned away by the creature before him. "Let go of me," Michael gasped, his breath shallow, his chest tightening with each passing second. But his words felt weak, swallowed by the overwhelming power of the figure's hold. For a moment, everything went black, utter, suffocating blackness. When Michael opened his eyes again, he was no longer standing. He was lying on the cold stone floor, his body completely immobilized. The room was still dark, but there was a strange light now, faint, flickering in the distance like a dying flame. He could hear his own breath, shallow and uneven, echoing in the stillness. The figure was gone, but something was worse than the absence of the creature. It was the presence of nothingness that weighed heavily on his chest. The oppressive quiet was all-encompassing, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Michael felt as though he might disappear entirely into it. "It's not over," the whisper returned, low and sinister. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure whether the voice was in his head or if it was coming from the shadows themselves, but he felt it. He felt the weight of the words pressing down on him. "You cannot escape." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift again. The walls closed in, warping and stretching, becoming something unfamiliar. The air grew thick, and the flickering light grew brighter, as though it were beckoning him forward. With great effort, Michael pushed himself up, his body aching, his head spinning. His surroundings were no longer the same. Everything felt warped, distorted. The room was no longer the place where he had fought the creature. It was a new place, something darker, more sinister. He stumbled toward the light, his legs weak beneath him. As he approached it, the light flickered and dimmed, revealing a strange door in the distance. It wasn't like any door he had ever seen. It was ancient, covered in strange markings and symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unholy light. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him like an invisible storm. "Go ahead," the voice purred. "Open it. The door is always waiting for you." Michael's stomach twisted. He knew he had no choice. He could feel it, the pull of the door, the way it called to him, beckoning him toward whatever lay beyond. He had no answers, no understanding of what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay here. Taking a deep breath, Michael reached for the door. His hand hovered just before the door, the symbols glowing brighter, as if responding to his presence. The air around him seemed to shift, thickening with a heavy, suffocating pressure. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a painful reminder that he was no longer in control of his own fate. The whispers had become deafening now, swirling around him in a maddening chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere, yet nowhere. "Open it, Michael," the voice whispered again, its tone low and insistent, laced with both temptation and warning. "You've come this far. There's no turning back now." He couldn't deny it anymore. Something inside him told him that he had no choice but to open the door. Whatever lay behind it, whatever horrors it held, were tied to the path he had already chosen. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was his reality now. Taking a deep breath, Michael reached forward, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the door. The moment his skin made contact, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the door itself were alive, reacting to his touch. His heart raced as he gripped the handle, the sensation of something unseen pulling at him from the other side. The air was thick with anticipation, and Michael could feel the weight of it, pressing down on him, suffocating him. With a quick motion, he twisted the handle and pulled the door open. A gust of cold air hit him like a wave, sending a shiver down his spine. The room beyond the door was impossibly dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow light whole. He could see nothing but an empty void, stretching endlessly before him, but he could feel it, the presence on the other side. It was waiting for him. "Go in," the voice urged, its tone now smooth and seductive. "This is where it all began. This is where your story truly ends." Michael hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his foot crossing the threshold of the door. As soon as he did, The darkness seemed to close in around him, consuming everything in its path. The door slammed shut behind him, and the echo reverberated through the air, the sound lingering long after it had closed. The space around him was disorienting, shifting, as if the walls themselves were alive, warping and moving in impossible ways. The floor beneath his feet was uneven, shifting like sand, and he struggled to keep his balance as he took slow, cautious steps forward. Every sense in his body screamed at him to turn back, to escape while he still had the chance. But there was no way out. Not anymore. As he moved deeper into the void, the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him on all sides. The voices were indistinct, overlapping, their words a jumble of chaos. But then, through the noise, one voice broke through, clear and unmistakable. "Michael!" He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He knew that voice. It was Emma's voice, soft, fragile, yet filled with a sense of sorrow and despair. "Emma!" he called out, his voice barely a whisper in the suffocating darkness. "Where are you?" "I'm here," the voice replied, but it sounded distant, as if it were coming from far away. "I'm always here, Michael." He turned, his eyes frantically searching for her, but there was nothing, just the endless void, the swirling shadows that seemed to mock him. The voice, however, continued, its tone growing more urgent. "You shouldn't have come here, Michael. This place, it's not what you think it is." His stomach twisted, a cold dread settling over him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What is this place? What's happening to you?" The voice faltered, then continued in a whisper that sent a chill through him. "It's not me anymore, Michael. I'm not the one you're looking for. What's here? It's not me. It never was." His heart pounded in his chest as the words sank in. He could feel the weight of the realization crushing him, suffocating him from the inside. Emma was gone. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't her anymore. "No." His voice cracked, his hands shaking as the truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "No, this can't be true. I've come all this way to save you." "I won't." "You never saved me," the voice interrupted, its tone now sharp and cruel. "You just followed me here. And now you're trapped too." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he staggered back, his vision blurring as panic set in. The darkness seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter and tighter, and the air became thick with a strange, suffocating energy. The temperature plummeted, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping toward him with slow, deliberate movements. Michael's heart raced as he turned, his eyes locking onto the figure. It was her, Emma, but she was different. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and lifeless. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings, and her once beautiful features were now twisted, warped by something beyond his understanding. "Emma," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible, barely able to form the words. She tilted her head, and for a brief moment, Michael thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a glimpse of the woman he once loved. But it was fleeting, gone before he could truly grasp it. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said, her voice no longer hers. It was cold, detached, and full of an eerie finality. "Now, you're just like me, trapped in this place. Forever." Michael's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. His hands trembled as he reached out toward her, but she took a step back, fading into the shadows. "There is no escape, Michael. There never was." The darkness pressed in tighter, swallowing him whole. He could feel his heart racing, his thoughts scattered, and the whispers growing louder, all-consuming. The door that had brought him here, his only hope, was nowhere to be found. "This is it," the voice murmured. "You belong here now. Forever." The darkness closed around him, and for the first time, Michael understood. There was no way out. Not for him. Not for anyone. The shadows pressed in on all sides, a suffocating weight that felt as though it might crush him at any moment. Michael's breaths came in ragged gasps, his body trembling uncontrollably as the darkness closed in. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, what was happening now. There had to be a way out. There had to be some escape from this nightmare, some hope, some... A sudden, harsh noise cut through the silence, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was the sound of a door creaking open. Michael's heart leapt in his chest, and without thinking, he scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the void in desperation. The door appeared before him, just as it had been before. The same strange markings, the same pulse of unearthly light. He couldn't see beyond it, but he could feel the pull, the irresistible force drawing him closer, offering him a way out. Was it real? Was this his chance? Or was it just another trick? Another trap? Don't go through it, the voice whispered again, colder than before. You know what lies on the other side. You know what you'll find. Michael ignored the voice, stepping forward, his legs barely able to carry him. Each step felt like an eternity, the weight of the darkness pressing against him with every motion. His body ached, his mind screamed for answers, but still he moved forward. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, but he had made up his mind. There was no turning back. He reached the door, his hand trembling as it touched the cold metal. The air around him grew still, the oppressive pressure lifting for a brief moment, but only to make way for something worse. A shadow stretched across the threshold, stretching its long, twisted fingers toward him. Without thinking, Michael flung the door open, stepping through into the unknown. The world beyond the door was not what he expected. There were no soft lights, no peaceful escape. Instead, the room was bathed in an unnatural, sickly green glow. The floor beneath him was slick and wet, like the surface of a swamp. A cold mist curled up from the ground, twisting around his feet like serpents, making each step a challenge. He felt the dampness seep into his bones, chilling him to the core. But what truly unsettled him was the silence. The silence that hung heavy in the air, like a suffocating blanket. There were no voices here, no whispers. Only the eerie sound of his own breathing, and the distant drip of water echoing from somewhere far away. The room was vast, stretching out into a seemingly endless abyss. The walls were covered in strange, jagged patterns, carvings that twisted and writhed as though they were alive. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, to move, as if reacting to his presence. He could feel them watching him, waiting for him to make a move. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the far side of the room, and Michael spun around, his heart racing. His eyes darted frantically, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing, only the darkness. Then, out of the mist, something emerged. It was hard to make out at first, just a shape, moving in and out of view like a shadow, always just out of reach. But as it drew closer, Michael's stomach churned in horror. It was a figure, humanoid, but its form was distorted, twisted. Its face was nothing but a gaping hole, empty and black, a darkness deeper than anything he had seen. Its limbs were long and unnaturally thin, covered in strange, slithering tendrils that seemed to reach out, brushing against the walls and floor as it moved. Michael stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the cold sweat on his skin, the panic rising in his throat. The thing, whatever it was, stopped, standing still in the center of the room, its black, hollow eyes locking onto him. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, and Michael's vision blurred. He could feel the pressure of the darkness closing in on him again, tighter and tighter, until he couldn't breathe. The whispers, the voices, they had returned, louder now, like a choir of tortured souls. "You shouldn't have come here, Michael," the voice said, but this time it wasn't just one. It was countless voices, all speaking in unison, echoing around him, reverberating in his skull. "This place was never meant for you. This is where the lost belong, the ones who choose to stay forever." The thing stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Michael's breath hitched in his throat as he turned to run. His legs felt heavy, his body sluggish, but he pushed forward, his only thought to escape this nightmare, to find some shred of hope. But the mist had thickened, and the floor beneath him had turned slick with something that felt wrong. He slipped, his body crashing to the ground, the world spinning around him. The creature's form loomed over him, its face now inches from his, its hollow eyes gazing into his very soul. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice sending shivers down his spine. "Not from me, not from this place. You belong to us now." With a final, desperate effort, Michael pushed himself to his feet. His mind was clouded, his vision distorted, but he couldn't give up. Not yet. He ran. The creature followed, its movements impossibly fast, gliding across the room without touching the ground. He could hear its growl, low and guttural, growing louder with every passing second. The whispers were deafening now, filling his mind with voices that demanded his attention, pulling at him, urging him to stop, to turn around. But Michael didn't stop. He couldn't. With each step, the room seemed to stretch and twist, the walls contorting in ways that defied logic. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the very air itself growing thick and heavy, but he pressed on. His lungs burned with each breath, his legs aching with exhaustion, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The creature was close now, too close. He could hear it behind him, its breathing heavy, its growls vibrating through the air. And then in an instant it lunged. Michael felt a sharp, icy pain as the creature's claws scraped against his back. He cried out in agony, but there was no time to dwell on the pain. He pushed forward, his legs moving on their own, his body acting on instinct. "There's no escape, Michael," the voice whispered in his ear, the tone cold and final. "You belong to this place now. You are one of us." But Michael didn't stop. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, the sound of the creature's claws scraping against the ground close behind him. His mind was racing, each thought jumbled and frantic, but one thing stood out above all: survival. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, anything, that could save him from this nightmarish reality. The room continued to stretch and twist around him, the walls bending and shifting, creating new paths, new corridors that seemed to appear out of thin air. The creature's growls grew louder, more ferocious with every passing second, its presence a constant, crushing weight on his mind. He could feel the cold breath of it against his neck, the shadows swirling around him, tightening like a noose. His legs were burning, his muscles aching, but he didn't dare stop. He had no choice but to run. The darkness seemed to be alive, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides, whispering, urging him to turn around, to face the creature. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when there was still a chance, however slim, of escape. Suddenly he saw it, a faint glimmer of light up ahead, barely visible through the thick fog. His heart surged with hope. Could it be? Was it a way out? He pushed himself harder, his body screaming in protest, his mind barely able to focus. But he had to reach that light. He had to know if it was his escape. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, more defined. It was a door, standing alone in the middle of the swirling mist. The creature's growls were now a deafening roar, but Michael couldn't stop. He reached the door, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled for the handle. "Don't go through it, Michael." The voice echoed again, louder than ever, its tone full of malice. "You're not meant to leave. You belong here. This is where you are supposed to be." But Michael didn't listen. He didn't have time to listen. With a frantic gasp, he twisted the handle, flinging the door open without a second thought. Beyond the door was a bright, blinding light. It was the kind of light that felt warm, inviting, as though it was offering him safety. For a moment, Michael stood frozen in the doorway, unsure if this was truly the escape he had been hoping for, or if it was yet another trap. But the growl of the creature behind him, closer now, its claws scraping against the floor, pushed him forward. He had no choice. He stepped into the light. For a brief moment, everything felt still. The air around him seemed to hum with energy. the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting as though it were nothing more than a bad memory. He blinked, adjusting to the sudden brightness, and found himself standing in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were made of cold gray stone, and there was a large, round window at the far end, through which he could see nothing but an endless void. For a moment, he let out a shaky breath of relief. He had made it. He was out of that cursed place. But then his relief turned to confusion. The room seemed wrong. Something was off. There was a deep, unsettling quiet that made his skin crawl. It felt like a place that wasn't meant to exist, like it was suspended outside of time, a limbo between worlds. The door slammed shut behind him, and Michael spun around, his breath catching in his throat. It was gone. The door that had brought him here, the one he had just stepped through, had vanished without a trace. There was no handle, no sign of its existence. The walls were smooth, featureless stone, and the only way out was the window at the far end of the room. Michael's pulse quickened as panic began to set in once more. He approached the window cautiously, his hands trembling as he placed them against the cold stone. He looked out, but there was nothing to see. No sky, no earth. Just an infinite expanse of swirling mist and shadow, stretching out endlessly in every direction. A cold, creeping dread began to settle over him. "It's just like before," the voice whispered in his mind. "You thought you escaped, but there is no escape from here. You are in between, and you will never leave." Michael's mind was reeling. Was this it? Was he trapped here forever, suspended in some endless void? The creature, Emma, everything had led him to this moment. But now, in this cold, empty room, it felt as if everything had been part of some grand, cruel illusion. He had no answers, no explanations. There was nothing but the darkness, the whispers, and the empty space around him. "You're not alone here," the voice continued, now soft and laced with something almost tender. "You never were." Suddenly, a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. His breath quickened, his chest tightening. The floor beneath him shifted, the stone cracking, and before he could react, something grabbed hold of his ankle. His body jerked downward, and he yelped in panic, trying to pull free. But the grip tightened. He looked down in horror, his eyes widening as he saw the dark, writhing tendrils reaching up from the floor, wrapping around his legs, his body. The shadows were alive, moving, like creatures of the abyss. They pulled at him with an unnatural strength, dragging him down into the ground. His body screamed in protest, every muscle straining as he fought to break free. He kicked, struggled, but the tendrils only tightened, dragging him deeper, pulling him toward the floor, toward whatever lay beneath it. "You belong to us, Michael," the voice whispered, now sweet and patient, as though it had all the time in the world. "You're part of this place now. Just like her. Just like the others." The tendrils wrapped around his chest, his arms, and he could feel his body being crushed, suffocated by the darkness. He could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as though they were celebrating his surrender, his fate. His heart hammered in his chest, and in that moment, he realized what had been happening all along. There was no escape. The darkness pressed in closer, the tendrils tightening around him with a suffocating grip. His chest heaved as he struggled, every breath feeling like a fight against a force stronger than anything he had ever known. The whispers, soft and insistent, grew louder, their voices becoming a cacophony in his mind. They were no longer individual voices, but a unified sound, a chorus of anguish and despair. "You can't escape, Michael. You never could." His limbs were paralyzed, the shadowy tendrils pulling him down deeper, further into the earth. His body felt heavy, as though it was being dragged through thick mud, but it wasn't mud, it was something far worse. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, opening, as if the very floor was becoming part of the creature's insidious grasp. "This place is your prison now," the voice whispered, its tone sweet, almost compassionate. "This is where the lost go, where the ones who wander without purpose become a part of the darkness." You were always meant to be here. Michael's vision blurred as he felt the last of his strength draining away. His heart raced, each beat thundering in his ears. The tendrils tightened, pulling him lower, deeper into the ground. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was trapped in an iron grip, unable to move or break free. Then, just as he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, there was a sudden shift. The tendrils loosened, just enough for him to take in a desperate, gasping breath. His eyes shot open, and he saw it, standing before him, in the shadowed corner of the room, was Emma. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she was watching him with a strange, unreadable expression. There was no warmth, no recognition. She was not the Emma he remembered, not the woman he had loved, the woman he had tried to save. "Emma," Michael whispered, his voice barely a rasp. She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, eerie smile. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment, as though everything that had happened had led to this, the moment he would join her in this dark, empty world. "You see now," the voice said, echoing through the room. "She was never meant to leave. None of you were." Michael's mind reeled, trying to comprehend the horror of the revelation. The missing persons, the strange disappearances, had they all ended up here? Were they all part of this same twisted fate? Had she been taken long before him, drawn into this place where time and space had no meaning? "You were all drawn in," the voice continued, "just like the others, and now you are part of us. Welcome to the endless void." The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. Michael could feel the weight of the room closing in on him, the cold, unrelenting presence of whatever was pulling the strings. Emma's smile remained frozen, but her eyes were empty, distant. She was no longer the person he knew. "Why?" he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the question. "Why did you do this? Why didn't you warn me?" Emma didn't speak, but her eyes flickered for a brief moment. It was the smallest of gestures, but in it Michael saw something. There was a trace of recognition, a flicker of the woman she had once been. "It was never her choice," the voice said, as if answering his thoughts. "Once you step through that door, there's no coming back. There's no choice, only the void." The tendrils began to pull at him again, their cold fingers wrapping around his arms, his chest. His body screamed in pain, but there was nothing left to do. The shadows were everywhere now, swirling around him, suffocating him. "You'll join her soon," the voice cooed. "But first, you will understand. You will understand the price of curiosity, the price of meddling with forces you don't understand." Michael's vision blurred, his breath shallow, as the darkness consumed him. He could feel himself slipping, his body no longer his own, his mind drowning in the endless void. The whispers filled his ears, voices from 1,000 lost souls, their cries echoing in the infinite blackness. And then, just as his mind began to unravel, something shifted. A single thought broke through the chaos, a thought of defiance. No, it was a simple thought, but it was enough. He would not let it end like this. He refused to become another lost soul, another forgotten piece of this endless, torturous cycle. He would fight until there was nothing left. With the last of his strength, he pushed back, his hands grasping at the tendrils, tearing them away from his body. The shadows hissed, recoiling as though stung. His vision swam in front of him, but he didn't care. He had to find a way out. He had to. As the tendrils recoiled, he stumbled back, his feet slipping on the slick floor. The room around him flickered, the walls warping, bending, as though they were alive, reacting to his defiance. The whispers grew frantic, voices rising in a crescendo of rage. But Michael didn't stop. He kept moving, his steps slow, deliberate. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in this place of endless torment, this place where the lost souls were trapped, where time and space had no meaning. The door, his only way out, was still there, just beyond the reach of the dark mist. It flickered with a faint light, an echo of hope. He had to reach it. He had to. No. The voice roared in his mind, its tone full of fury and despair. You can't escape. You are one of us now. But Michael did not listen. With the last of his strength, he pushed forward, his hand reaching for the door. The darkness surged around him, but it was too late. His hand touched the cold metal of the door, and in that moment, everything froze. The whispers stopped. The tendrils loosened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. For a moment, everything was still. The air around him felt thick and heavy, like the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Michael stood there, hand gripping the door, his heart pounding, his body shaking with exhaustion and fear. He could still hear the faintest echoes of the voices, but they had become distant, muffled, like they were trapped behind a wall. The weight of the darkness, though present, felt less oppressive. It was as though the very act of defiance had created a crack in the world around him, a fissure through which light could slip in. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen in place, but it felt like an eternity. The whispers, the tendrils, the suffocating presence that had been chasing him. Everything seemed to recede, as if the room itself had grown tired, or perhaps even afraid. The door beneath his fingers seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it had been waiting for him, too. It wasn't just a door, it was something more. Michael could feel the faint vibration in his hands, a pulse that seemed to match his heartbeat. He had to open it. This was his chance. With a deep breath, Michael pushed against the door, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. The door creaked loudly, as if it hadn't been opened in ages, but it gave way, revealing a sliver of what lay beyond. For a moment, he could see nothing, just a blinding white light, so bright it hurt his eyes. But through the haze, he could feel something more. A pull, an invitation, as if the light was reaching for him, offering him a way out. Without thinking, he stepped forward. The world around him shifted again. The darkness, the tendrils, the suffocating whispers, they all vanished in an instant, replaced by a sensation of weightlessness. The ground beneath his feet disappeared, and Michael felt himself floating, as though he were suspended in midair. The light enveloped him completely, its warmth wrapping around him like a protective cocoon. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. It was too surreal, too strange, and yet it felt right. The air was fresh, the atmosphere calm, as though he had crossed into another realm entirely. He blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all he could see was the light, the sensation of peace that washed over him. And then, as if waking from a deep slumber, his feet touched solid ground again. He opened his eyes. The world around him had changed. He was standing in the middle of a vast, open space, a seemingly endless field of green grass stretching out in every direction. The sky above him was a brilliant blue, the air clean and crisp. It felt so real, so alive, that he could hardly believe it. There was no trace of the dark room, no sign of the creature, no whispers of the voices that had tormented him for so long. It was peaceful here, serene. For the first time since he had entered that cursed place, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever, relief. He took a step forward, his feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. As he walked, he glanced around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. There were no roads, no paths, no buildings, just an open expanse that stretched out infinitely, untouched by time or the chaos he had left behind. In the distance, he could see a small cluster of trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. He was free. But then, a soft sound broke the silence. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint rustling, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as he turned toward it, his heart began to race again. There, at the edge of the field, was a figure. It was a woman, standing alone beneath the trees. She was dressed in a long, flowing white dress, her hair flowing freely around her shoulders, and her back was to him. The figure stood motionless, but something about her, something about the way she stood there made Michael feel uneasy. He felt drawn to her. but there was a gnawing sense of dread growing in the pit of his stomach. Who is she? He thought, his heart skipping a beat. He took a tentative step toward her, his breath catching in his throat. The woman remained still, her face hidden, her body as motionless as a statue. The wind seemed to swirl around her, but she didn't react. As Michael got closer, the unease grew. Something about the figure felt wrong. The closer he came, the more he could sense an overwhelming presence, something dark and ancient. And then, as though sensing his approach, the woman turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that stared at him without emotion. Her lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too unnaturally long. But it was her eyes that froze him in place. They were empty, dark, bottomless pits that seemed to pull him in, like there was nothing left of the person she had once been. No, Michael's mind screamed, but his body refused to obey. The woman opened her mouth, her voice a soft, chilling whisper. "You should have stayed in the dark, Michael." The words were clear, but they weren't spoken by her. No, they came from everywhere. They came from the sky, from the trees, from the very ground beneath him. The voice echoed in his mind, and he could feel it tightening around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "You cannot leave. You will never leave." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the world around him began to warp, the grass beneath his feet shifting and twisting. The trees began to bend at unnatural angles, their limbs reaching out like twisted, gnarled fingers. The sky darkened, clouds swirling, and the once pleasant breeze turned cold and biting. The woman began to move toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on him. Every step she took seemed to make the ground beneath him tremble. "You belong here now," the voice repeated, growing louder, more insistent. "Just like all the others. Just like Emma." Michael's mind reeled. It was the same voice, the same force that had trapped him before. And now it was here again in this strange, surreal world. He had thought he had escaped, but now it seemed that escape had been nothing more than a mirage, a false hope. The woman was closer now, her lips curled into a faint smile, but it was a smile of mockery, of triumph. "There is no escape for you, Michael." Michael stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps, but the world around him was closing in, pressing in on him. The trees leaned closer, their shadows stretching long, their twisted branches reaching out to ensnare him. There was no way out. Michael's heart raced, his chest tight as the air around him grew colder. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms, reaching for him. The once peaceful field had become a nightmare, an illusion that crumbled before his eyes. The woman, her sharp features illuminated by an unnatural glow, took another step toward him, her empty eyes never leaving his face. "You're already here," the voice whispered, almost tenderly now, like a lullaby. "You've always been here, Michael. You just didn't know it until now." He backed away, his feet slipping on the damp, uneven ground, but no matter how much he moved, the woman was always closer. Her presence loomed, filling the space with a suffocating weight that pressed down on him like a physical force. The air was thick with tension, charged with a sense of finality, as though every moment was leading towards something inevitable. Michael reached out, his fingers brushing against the bark of one of the trees, but it wasn't solid. It felt alive, as if the tree itself was a part of the nightmare he had entered. The surface was warm and soft, like flesh, and the bark pulsed under his touch. "Leave it alone, Michael." The voice now hissed, the sweet tone replaced by something darker. "You shouldn't have touched it. You shouldn't have come here." The ground beneath his feet trembled again, and the shadows grew longer, twisting and writhing as if alive. The woman had stopped moving for a moment, watching him with that same vacant, emotionless gaze. But Michael could feel her eyes boring into him, probing his every thought, searching for his fear. "It's too late for you," she said, her voice soft but chilling. "You're already part of this place." Michael stumbled backward, his breath ragged, the whispers growing louder in his mind. The more he tried to escape, the more the world around him seemed to close in. The sky above darkened, swirling like a storm about to break. The soft grass beneath his feet shifted to rough, cold stone, and the field that had once seemed endless now appeared confined, a trap with no way out. "This is your fate now," the voice said, its tone final. "You are not the first to wander into this place, and you will not be the last. There are others trapped just like you, all of them searching for a way out, all of them lost in the same cycle. And now you will join them." The woman began to move again, her steps slow but steady, her figure seemingly growing larger as she approached. Her eyes never left his, and Michael could feel his will crumbling under the weight of her gaze. "You cannot fight what you are now, Michael," she said, her voice cold and distant. "You will be consumed by this place. Like Emma, like all the others before you. Forever." He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. His body was frozen, caught in a trance-like state, as if the very ground was holding him in place. The trees loomed closer, their branches swaying violently in the unnatural wind that whipped through the field, their twisted shapes casting grotesque shadows over the landscape. And then Michael felt it, a presence behind him. The air shifted, the temperature dropping even further, and the feeling of being watched intensified. He turned, his heart in his throat, but when he saw what stood before him, he froze. There, standing in the darkness, were the figures of people he recognized. There was Emma, her face pale and twisted, her eyes empty, just as they had been when he last saw her. But now she was not alone. There were others, dozens of them, maybe more. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies hunched and frail, their eyes hollow with a profound emptiness. Some of them reached out toward him, their hands twisted and malformed, fingers like claws. "They were the ones who came before you," the voice whispered again, the chorus of lost souls in the distance growing louder. "And now, they are part of the darkness, just like you will be." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He tried to step backward, but the field seemed to stretch infinitely before him. The shadows loomed larger, pressing against him from all sides. There was no escape, no way out. "You thought you could save her," the voice said, its tone almost mocking. "You thought you could save yourself, but you were always meant to be here. You were never going to leave." Emma's form, now standing at the forefront of the group, tilted her head to the side, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You should have listened, Michael," she whispered. "We all tried to warn you. We all tried to tell you that this place takes everyone who enters. No one escapes. No one." Michael took a step back, his legs weak, his mind spinning. His thoughts raced, but there was no clarity, no way to understand the full extent of the nightmare he was trapped in. The figures around him seemed to close in, their eyes all locked on him, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets being controlled by an unseen hand. "It doesn't matter now," Emma said, her voice soft but filled with a terrible finality. "You've crossed the line. Now, you belong to us." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the air grew heavier, the darkness around him swirling like a storm, the voices of the lost souls rising in a crescendo of despair. The ground seemed to shake beneath his feet, and the figures began to move toward him, their outstretched hands reaching for him, their fingers brushing against his skin with a coldness that sent a shiver down his spine. "It's time," the voice whispered in his mind, its tone almost gentle now. "Time for you to join the others. Time for you to become one with the darkness." And as the figures surrounded him, their hands closing around him, their eyes locked on his, Michael realized the truth. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. He was lost. The darkness around Michael thickened, and his limbs felt heavier with each passing second. The figures pressed closer, their faces distorted with twisted smiles, their cold hands brushing against his skin like the touch of death itself. The whispers, the voices of the lost souls, grew louder in his ears, filling his mind with an overwhelming cacophony of despair. The weight of the voices, the touch of the figures, the overwhelming sense of dread, they all merged into one singular truth. There was no way out. He had tried to escape, to defy the pull of the whispers, to find a way to break free. But now, as the hands wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the darkness, Michael realized the harsh reality. The place wasn't just a trap. It was a prison for lost souls, an eternal limbo where the past and present collided, where the living and the dead were bound together. The woman, who had once stood alone beneath the trees, now loomed before him. Her pale face twisted into a smile, her eyes dark and hollow. She was not a figure of compassion or mercy. She was the keeper of this place, the one who watched over the souls that wandered in, never to leave. And now Michael was one of them. "It's over," the voice whispered again, this time in a tone of cruel finality. "You are ours now, just like all the others. Just like Emma. Just like every lost soul that has ever come here." His body felt as though it were being pulled into the earth, the very ground beneath him sinking and shifting, as though it were alive, hungry for his soul. The faces of the others, the lost ones, hovered around him, their hollow eyes staring with an emptiness that chilled him to his core. "There is no escaping the cycle," the woman said, her voice now soft, almost gentle. "It's too late for you, Michael. You are part of this place now, bound to it for eternity. Forever lost, forever wandering." The figures tightened their grip on him, and Michael could feel his breath growing shallow, his body beginning to numb. His thoughts blurred together, the voices and the faces merging into one indistinct mass of terror and regret. He wanted to scream, to fight, to break free, but there was no fight left in him. His will had been broken, his mind cracked under the weight of the darkness. He had failed. He had been consumed. As the shadows closed in around him, the world twisted, and the voices faded into a single, all-encompassing silence. Michael woke up, but the reality he found himself in was not much different from the one he had left. He was standing once more in the center of the field, surrounded by the twisted trees, the endless horizon stretching out before him. The sky was dark, the wind biting and cold, and the air thick with the presence of the lost souls. His body felt numb, as though it had been stripped of all sensation, but his mind was sharp. He could still remember everything. The woman, the voices, the figures, and as he turned, he saw them. The others, the lost souls. They were there, standing in the distance, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Emma was among them, her twisted face staring with that same vacant expression, her hands reaching toward him, pulling him into the fold. Michael stepped forward, the realization crashing down on him. There was no escape. There never had been. The field stretched on forever, and Michael, now one of the lost, wandered in eternal darkness, just another soul among the countless others trapped in the endless cycle of despair. And so, the whispers continued, calling out to those who dared to listen, pulling them into the door, into the trap, until there were no more. And the whispers became just one unbroken, eternal sound. And that's the end of the story.